And so I think there's going to have to be some give on both sides, right? The government's going to want to say, okay, we understand it. We don't want to curb technology. We never want to, but we also want to try to protect people. And so, I think some people have to get comfortable a little bit with, having some amount of, data attached to a wallet for this to really succeed. I can tell you from just the level of calls I'm getting into our firm about people being defrauded has begun to spike, because it takes a couple months for the pig butchering and investment fraud scams around cryptocurrencies to take place, and then people realize they're being defrauded, and now you're starting to see it. The analogy I'll use is tax evasion versus tax aversion. Tax aversion is smart business. Tax evasion is a federal tax offense.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier podcast. This week we have on Ren McEachern. Ren, welcome.
Joe, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to our discussion. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Glad to have you on. Let's talk about your background and your experience for those that may not know who you are. Can you kind of elaborate on what your background and experience is?
Yeah, sure. I think that what's most relevant, at least to begin with, is I was 12 years in the FBI, working lots of different violations. But the last 5 years, I spent a lot of my time and effort leading the charge and actually innovating the FBI around money laundering and the way money flows around the world. At the time, I was the acting chief of the National Corruption Unit for the FBI as a supervisory special agent. And we were looking at bribery cases involving violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which really is about companies paying bribes to foreign officials for contracts, essentially. And those investigations are all about following them. And so we would spend a lot of time looking at bank records and wires and chips and all sorts of banking activity from all over the globe and movements of funds all over to understand where the case lies. And as you can imagine, if you know where the money goes and where it flows to, the case will come around that, right? And so we spent a lot of time with forensic accountants, really specialized people around how money works, how money flows through institutions, and where there are places where it's really hard, especially getting certified evidence from overseas. In all of that, though, I worked with a lot of different regulatory agencies and law enforcement groups and intelligence groups, and really got a wonderful understanding about how the world works when it comes to movements of money and assets, of course. And then the other part of that job is we would also chase assets, right? So we would also look for bribery, but then also go after the ill-gotten gains, right? So chasing yachts around and looking to seize or freeze those, right? When the situation made sense and was relevant. I think now with some of the Russian sanctions, people understand the importance of assets and what that means to an organization, things like that. So the last 5 years at the FBI, I worked on those areas and really got a wonderful education around those things. And then about 6 years ago, I left the Bureau after 12 years and went to Exeter, where a wonderful governance, risk, and compliance company went over there as a managing director and helped stood up their advisory practice, their federal practice here in Washington, D.C. And really what's wonderful about Exeter and what was so amazing about the company at the time and what is still amazing about the company now is their use of artificial intelligence to understand big data problems, right? Understanding open source data, initially around third-party risk issues, understanding what a company's ultimate beneficial ownership, what we call UBO, or who the people are behind companies and things like that, to understand the risk around third parties. And then later on, they moved into supply chain risk and illumination. Again, really relevant, really important areas for both the government and commercial entities. But it's really about big data and understanding what you can pull in and look at and evaluate, and then ultimately use some really high-end analysis, whether it's AI and ML, to understand relevant relationships and connectivity to say, hey, these two things are connected. This is why it's important. And this helps us understand the risk and how to mitigate those risks. And so it was amazing to work with developers and engineers who are really ahead of their game in the AI space, and to think about what the art of the possible is, and then really execute on that in real terms. And so wonderful experience there as well. And then a couple of years ago, left and started my own company. And then just over a year ago, co-founded Fraud Optics, which was, I think, obviously relevant for our conversation today. But again, it also mimics the sense of understanding the big data problem. I know we'll get into it on the conversation. But essentially, a former FBI guy who understands how money moves around and has a lot of stories and understands how bad actors work and how they need to use resources to find illicit funds and move things around, but also steeped with how to use AI to take on the big data challenges. So here we are today.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome quick overview. And I'm excited to dive into your background and obviously how it relates to Bitcoin as well. With your experience with money laundering and doing cases that involved money laundering, were most of those using like dollar wire transfers, or were they like, was it physical cash, or was it like crypto and Bitcoin as well? Like, what would be like the breakdown? Is there one that's more common than the other?
Great question. Back when I was still at the FBI, we had not officially seen any Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA investigations where we could definitively say cryptocurrency was being used in the furtherance of the scheme. We were seeing, though, however, just from a basic criminal level, that street dealers of narcotics were using Bitcoins. Example, right? So if those guys are using it, which are, I would say, are low-level, sophisticated bad actors, certainly the money launderers of the world were already doing this and were probably ahead of us. Unfortunately, a lot of times in law enforcement, we're behind the curve and we're trying to catch up, right? But we were not seeing cryptocurrency being used to move at that time, 6 years ago, in those types of cases. It was cash, right, which was still king lots of times, but would be cash like in a suitcase, in a private jet, right, being transferred between two people in a foreign jurisdiction, right, on a handshake and a wink, right. But often that would then lead to a more established relationship where you have legitimate accounts, illegitimate accounts, commingling funds, and then you'd see wires, right. Especially if we're of foreign, transfers. There's not a lot of check writing. It's really about wires. A domestic corruption case, sure, you look at checks and check images where you're looking through the forensic accounting, the bank records. But when you're looking at global movements, it's all about wires or alternative assets, right? Where they have something liquid they can move around pretty easily that would have value here and the same value they have over here and not be traceable. The one issue, as you can imagine, is the U.S. dollar gives jurisdictions to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and of course the FBI and others like HSI and Secret Service for investigation purposes. And so people would often try to avoid the U.S. dollar to do business globally, but that's very hard, right? Because everybody still wants the stability of our currency and our markets in addition to. So it was always about the U.S. dollar, but they tried to stay away from it, but ultimately very difficult. And the other thing about wires, which is important, is something like 95%, 96, 97% of the wires in the world at some point will travel through our Fed wire system and go through New York. And so that will actually give jurisdiction in criminal cases in some instances. So wires do play a part in the larger cryptocurrency discussions where you talk about fiat conversion. And so that is an angle for investigations and a hook for jurisdiction as well.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So I guess if someone was sending, a $10 million wire transfer in somewhere in Europe or, Asia or wherever, and it already occurred, would the FBI be able to like go in and prevent it, like reverse it potentially, or how would that work?
So there are some capabilities if a wire is detected to be illicit within a short amount of time. There's an activity called kill chain. You can go through FinCEN, which is a treasury, component, and you can, in fact, stop some domestic wires, very rarely international wires. It has no U.S. connectivity. U.S. Treasury and other components of the U.S. government are not going to likely to help. But generally, you should think about a wire. Once a wire goes through, it's basically gone. However, every bank right, has, I should say every bank, every reputable bank will do some know your customer type of diligence, right? So the KYC and onboarding. And so when someone opens an account, they'll have to provide some documents, hopefully a license that they verified and some other documents to show this is who I am. So even though you have a wire, you still should in theory, be able to go to that financial institution and say, hey, I'm conducting an investigation for such and such a matter. I am asking for this type of information. And so there are sometimes you can find some information, but as far as clawing back the money, more often than not, you are, it's going to be very unlikely. You're going to be looking for money.
Interesting. For like international banks, if you go to them and you're like, hey, I need to know the specific customer information, like their balance, and if they had wire transfer or whatever you're trying to figure out, or maybe take their assets since you may be highly suspicious of them or they may be convicted. Like, is that super easy, or like, do you have a lot of success there, or no, not at all?
So going back to my government days, you have to have a treaty with that country. So you have to, it's called a Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, an MLAT. And what that does is that allows you to then do some work in the United States and, for example, get a subpoena here in the United States for a bank, and then go to that institution via the DOJ process where governments can come together and communicate on global investigations like money laundering and say, hey, I have an MLAT in place. I'm requesting bank information as a part of an investigation. Sometimes they're going to ask for the probable cause for that. And then sometimes you'll have to provide that. And then that process will take shape, but it will take weeks to months, if not years, depending on the treaties, right? And treaties are different with every country. And so it may take a little longer with the Swiss, an example, versus the UK, right? And obviously these treaties are always changing, and there's always a political dynamic, right? There's a quid pro quo, sometimes with governments too, as well, depending on relationships. And so that goes up and down, but there are processes in place to legally get banking information, and that I could then introduce as certified evidence in a trial, in a criminal prosecution of someone saying, yeah, these foreign bank records I can show are relevant to this wire fraud, this money laundering case, or this foreign bribery case, or this fraud case. And this person identified in those bank records, we can show made those transfers and was likely a part of that conspiracy.
It's quite interesting. Did you have a lot of experience working with the dark web at all, or was it mainly just people using normal internet and normal things?
Yeah, so not so much in my time where I was working Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because that was much more around corporates and individuals working for those corporations who were involved in those transactions. Certainly, other elements of the FBI were very much involved in the deep and dark web. And obviously, it was very clear that there were areas that people felt comfortable communicating nefarious activity and communications in those areas. We now know that more often people are going to places like either deep or dark web, or places where they think they have some protections from the quote unquote government surveillance, a place like Discord or Telegram, where they think they're more likely to have conversations where they're not going to be identified potentially. But it's always changing, as you know. Whatever technologies that the bad actors are using on whatever format they're communicating, it's always a step ahead, oftentimes, of the government looking at, from a criminal investigative lens. Now, the intelligence agencies are a little different, they're a little faster, more nimble to understand communications that exist in deep and dark web formats. But on the criminal side, it's a little slower, right? And then I have to prove that I had to use this type of format, I had to use this tool or platform to collect those communications, and then ultimately have to prove that these communications are real and associated to the person I'm investigating. That's very difficult, as you can imagine, by the way the format's set up, right? It's on purpose, right? The anonymity is obviously the intent of some of those platforms. So, and that's how you got to grow, and it continues to foster into new technologies that are really hard. Encrypted technologies are the same thing, whether they're talking or sending text messages. It's the same level of technical requirements, and often are beyond, as you know, the ability to really decipher what's being said. So people are only getting smarter.
That makes sense. This one may not be super relevant for like your specific background, but I'm kind of curious to hear what you think. I think I saw that Brazil like banned access to twitter.com or x.com recently. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do, but I find that, that's a hard thing to do. When we've talked about, right, banning TikTok here, now we've actually passed legislation to do that, right? Or they have to divest, right? Even with detecting, even if you use a VPN, right, you're still going to likely be able to get around, I think, some of those tripwires that would be in place from a government saying, hey, we're going to ban that app. Same thing in Brazil. And the fines look pretty large. I believe something like $8,000 a day, if I read that correctly. And I apologize for not being right up on the exact detail. But Brazil is a massive country. 230 million people, I believe, live in Brazil, and they're very smart, very savvy, huge global business people. I've done a lot of business in Brazil. They are truly global business people, and so I have a hard time thinking the government's going to completely be able to say no Twitter/X for you. Now, obviously, there's a different discussion occurring when the Supreme Court wants to tell people what First Amendment rights look like in the United States. Brazil's a little different, right? But there's a lot going on with that, and I believe they are targeting SpaceX too. So maybe it sounds a little personal, and also, of course, Elon has the ability to use satellites better than anybody else with communication too. So, if Brazil wants to do that, that's their prerogative. But you and I think both know that's very, very difficult to do.
You brought up the interesting story that you experienced. I think it was back at the FBI about like chasing yachts. Can you kind of elaborate on what happened there? So I'll be careful what I say, because as far as where cases stand in education and sources and methods, obviously are always things we have to protect. But as you can imagine, a lot of the time when we're investigating corrupt foreign officials who've made millions of dollars, let's say a minister of oil for an oil-rich country, that person is in a great position to often put their hand out for bribes in order to give favoritism and then give a contract. And they can name their price, and then that money increases as the contracts get renewed, right? And then those people need to park money in places that are quote unquote safe, but also they tend to want to buy things that are fun, right? Like a yacht. And so when we can determine that the illicit funds from a foreign bribery issue that I've just described that would have jurisdictional attachment to the United States, we can then go after the assets, right? Because before, there's a new extortion law just was recently passed to actually take on the actual foreign official. But under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, we actually couldn't target the official. We would target the company and the agents paying the bribe, but we can go after the foreign official. As you can imagine, the United States targeting foreign officials gets also tricky. But these foreign officials often buy property in the United States, right? Because of for example, condos in Miami, right? We see all sorts of foreign money buying condos in places like Miami, Beverly Hills, Manhattan, right? There's lots of examples. But in cases of like yachts, which are a little bit more mobile than a condo, and are often protected under very specific tax-purposed LLCs in tax havens for tax evasion and aversion, both legal and illegal. When we can make that connection, we're gonna actually go after that asset. We have to go through the process here in the United States to do that, but it's a good asset to go after because often they're worth, right? A big yacht can be worth a couple $100 million. But the problem always is finding those yachts in jurisdictions, and so that we are actually have again a treaty with, right? And so if the bad actors are smart and they've bought a yacht, which might not be the wisest thing because it does put a kind of target on their back.
they'll keep it in a jurisdiction where we can't get to. And so what we want to do is monitor the yachts and say, oh, wait a minute, they're going on a trip. Where are they going? Is that a friendly jurisdiction? And so in one example, we were following a yacht and it would go somewhere and you'd have to move a lot of things logistically and get people in place to try to seize a yacht in a foreign jurisdiction. You have to talk to a lot of people. And it would would go out and it would duck back into a place. It's almost like a cat and mouse game. The difference is we're talking about a 300 foot yacht. So it's very interesting. It's work you never think you're going to get into. And the way those yachts work and also the way you seize them and then have to maintain them is also another expense. We're seeing this now with some of the evasion issues with the oligarchs from Russia, and the expense comes on the United States or Italy is another example. They have to maintain those yachts, but chasing assets like a yacht is really difficult, or a private jet. Actually, very interesting enough, the United States just actually basically took Venezuela's Air Force One and captured that in the Dominican Republic. This is something I was reading over the weekend. Another example, now that jet may be worth $30 million, and so that's a really good target. Those are much harder than the condo in Miami. And then also like condos in New York, which are worth sometimes $50 million. But we're always looking at clawback, right? And this is obviously very relevant to cryptocurrency, right? The ability to claw back and seize illicit gains, very different as we know in the blockchain and the cryptocurrency world versus traditional finance, right? Traditional assets, traditional seizure, forfeiture warrants. It could be different, could be more different, quite frankly, in worlds apart, but fascinating just the same.
Yeah. When the FBI or another government agency does seize a yacht or a condo, what's the process like after that? Like, do they immediately like sell it for cash and do whatever they want? Or like, how does that work?
It depends, right? In some cases, like sanctions, they actually can't sell that asset, right? Because in theory, that person is under sanctions. It doesn't mean they've been charged with a crime necessarily. Oftentimes, sanctions come with crimes and indictments. But if it's just sanctioned, you cannot liquidate it in the United States. You have to have some other types of behavior attached to that in order to do that. But let's say that person's been indicted under the Department of Justice, and within that indictment, that there's these assets are named in as potential for seizure and forfeiture. Yes, we will seize that. And then we also work closely with U.S. Marshals or experts actually in this. They'll maintain that asset, do an inspection on it, understand its value at the time, making sure it doesn't lose value, which is tricky depending on the asset. And then there's a process once that that case has been adjudicated, found guilty, and we can say, yes, we can liquidate that asset. The U.S. Marshal Service, which is under the Department of Justice, has a very clear program about how to put these things essentially up for auction. And so in theory, you could go and try to buy, the yacht of a criminal that was found guilty in the United States, and that yacht would go for sale. And it's usually at a discount. Not always, but generally. In some cases, you can sanction and you can liquidate, but those examples get really in the weeds. And so I'll spare your audience on those, but two different areas of seizure, but liquidation is much, much more rare in the sanction side versus a criminal conviction.
Mm-hmm. So I guess like when it comes to seizing assets, it seems like something that's more portable, like is obviously quote unquote better or harder to seize, better for the criminal and harder to seize for the FBI or whoever. Is Bitcoin like probably one of the most hardest to seize assets in the world, or no?
I would say for sure it's got to be one of the most difficult challenges currently, in the sense that we all like the blockchain is beautiful from a forensic accounting standpoint. We can see the tokens move around. You see dates and times and amounts and values, and you can see where it goes and when it went here and when it went there.
In this frontier moment, Ren is talking about how a transparent, open public blockchain is a forensic accountant's dream. But what's an interesting situation where forensic accounting uncovered a serious fraudulent scheme? Well, it was a pretty interesting case involving a woman named Rita Crundwell on embezzlement from a city in Illinois. From 1991 to 2012, Rita Crundwell embezzled over $53 million from the city of Dixon, Illinois, a small town with a population of around 16,000. Crundwell used her position as controller to divert funds into a secret bank account she controlled. She used the stolen money to finance a pretty lavish lifestyle, including breeding champion horses, buying luxury cars, and funding extravagant parties. Crundwell was arrested in 2012, pleaded guilty to wire fraud, and she was sentenced to nearly 20 years in federal prison. So, with a public ledger, fraud may be easier to detect than Bitcoin, but it may be more difficult to seize than a traditional bank account. And now back to the show.
But as we know, the issue, and I really think the Achilles heel and one of the big issues for adoption is these private wallets. And so, as we discussed with a bank account, let's say a foreign bank account in the United Kingdom, or even let's use Malta, an EU country, where I send a mutual legal assistance treaty, an MLAT request to Malta for that bank account, and the bank will likely accept that and provide information because they actually ask for the information because they have their own requirements under the EU, right? Unlike a private wallet, right, where they're by their very nature it's decentralized, right? That's one of the great things about it, right? Is the decentralized nature and the speed of things, right? And it's less expensive, right? It's global, all of these wonderful things. But because of the way those wallets are set up, no one is asking, right, for their KYC or know your customer information or your onboarding information. Now, in some examples, of course, there are exchanges that do that, and some do it better than others. We know that. The ones that are U.S.-based are obviously very, very much want to be compliant. I do believe that. But if you're talking about an overseas exchange in a low-integrity jurisdiction, and they really like the fact that they don't have to ask for information, and I identify that the exchange may have the wallet, and I ask for information, they may say, you know what, go pound sand, right? Either with the government, right? If I was back with the FBI and said, hey, here is my letter of I need information. I'm investigating a crime, and this person clearly is to us. We have probable cause that the crypto is in this wallet. You have control of that wallet. In that example of an exchange, they may say, we don't collect information like that. We can't help you, or we don't respond to that request. Or if it's just truly a private wallet, I don't even know who to contact, right? Mm-hmm. There's no bank address, right? There's no corporate registry in that example, right? There's no lookup to say, oh, this wallet belongs to so-and-so, and you can contact them here. And so not even knowing the who or the what to ask for, to inquire to prevents even inquiry, right? And then if I was able to identify that person, they don't have to even play ball, right? They can say, okay, well, that's great, but I don't need to respond to that request. There's other ways the U.S. government and other government agencies can bring criminal indictments and pressure on that person legally. But when it comes to the key and getting access to the wallet to seize, much more difficult, if not in some cases impossible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. This may be something that you may not have a good answer to, or you may not know much about, but I've seen historically, the U.S. government has captured and seized Bitcoin. And I think even right now, they may hold 100,000 Bitcoin or 200,000 Bitcoin. Yeah. I don't know what the exact number is. And people will see the coins move to Coinbase Prime or Coinbase custody, and they're like, oh my gosh, they're about to sell it, or oh my gosh, they're not going to sell it, or they're just holding it. Do you have any light on how the government decides to sell those specific coins, or do you happen to know the cases that those are tied to, or is it kind of just there's so much going on that you may not have a good answer?
Well, in the example of Silk Road, right, which is an older case, but was really one of the very first cases in which Bitcoin was seized in a federal investigation. The Drug Enforcement Administration, among others, led that investigation with the DOJ. They were very successful, right? And I know there's a lot of people who are upset that the sentencing was so significant, but the drug angle to that is where that came from. in that example, they were able to seize quite a bit, right?
Yep.
And oftentimes what happens if we're able to, again, if my government hat on, if we're able to arrest the person, they're facing 20, 25 years, on a federal charge, is a lot. But in money laundering, 20 years, you could get 20 years on a few counts pretty quickly. If that person wants to cooperate, they may say, you know what, as part of your cooperation agreement with the Department of Justice, that doesn't happen with the enforcement agencies, with their lawyers, they can say, okay, if we provide the keys and you can seize, X amount, how do we work that through cooperation? So that's generally where you see it, where there's a potential for that, or there's a ruse, right? Where someone was thinking about, okay, I need to keep moving my stolen crypto around so that the government doesn't catch up to it, and they make a mistake and someone comes up to them and says, oh, I'll take care of it. I have the best security. The government never knows who I am. It's actually the government, right?
Yeah.
So that's another example, right, of a ruse. But when and as you know, a lot of these wallets for the government are already labeled, right? Like everybody knows, oh, that's a government wallet. It's got, like you said, 1,000, BTC. Okay. Right. And then moving it around, just because they're moving it around doesn't necessarily means they're liquidating it. And they can't liquidate it until really after the case has been adjudicated in all of the due process has gone through the entirety of that process to say, okay, yeah, now you can liquidate those assets to include cryptocurrencies. So just because there's movement doesn't mean something's exactly happening. They may be moving it because there's a new contract for storage, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe they've decided they don't want to hold it at Coinbase in that example. They want to move it to a different group, or they want to break it up so it's not a sitting target, right, of people trying to, to hack it, right? And so it really quite much depends. What I can tell you, though, is the reality of cryptocurrency-related crime and the reality of the need for seizure and forfeiture is only going to grow exponentially in this. Things like the spot Bitcoin ETF approval, now ETH, right? That means you're going to have legitimate criminal investigations into these things, right? Even though those are products from banks or financial institutions or investment groups. The adoption that's come out of that, the mass adoption that's been pushed for because of those things, both legitimate and illegitimate, means there's going to be more investigations by governments, not just the U.S., of course, where seizure and forfeiture and eventual liquidation is going to be part of that discussion. And that's why you have legislation in the EU like MiCA that's been passed about various ways of asking questions about who owns the wallet, onboarding exchanges, and making sure that they're acting like a bank. Under the Bank Secrecy Act here in the United States, the BSA, something similar to that for exchanges, right? And then we all know that there's been a lot of opinions, I'll say, from the SEC about, these industries about commodities and securities, and these opinions under the current commissioner continue, right? And we're seeing some confusion, I think, about whether there's enforcement being that's occurring based on some expectation from the government that this is a commodity or it's a security, because that also changes the way the government regulates that and the requirements that if you're going to be handling securities versus a commodity, what you have to do to understand who's transacting with that, right? And this all goes back to this original, discussion that we've had about, the people behind it, right? If you're trying to seize something, understanding the people behind it, is critical. And if you don't have that information, just you're basically screwed. And so that's why you're seeing these discussions play out. As your audience knows well, there's multiple, legislative ideas floating around. I think we're now at 5 bills floating around both chambers, different levels of legislation that would be very similar to what's going on at MiCA. Put away some of the stablecoin stuff for a second, but I think that's what people see is going to be required, even though it seems like, we love the idea of decentralized, banking and what we get from cryptocurrency, but there's going to have to be some level of compromise to protect all the victims that we've been dealing with on signature scams and ransomware that gets sent to these wallets, right? Holds, medical records hostage and things like this. And so you're seeing this play out, Joe, as you know. It's an exciting time because we're literally watching it day to day play out. The government's always thinking about, I know people want to go on these conspiracy theories that they want to control everything, and they want to go to a centralized digital currency and all these things. But really, the government is really often just trying to protect people that become victims right now. And, every week I have to talk to pig butchering, victims, and it's brutal. And I don't have a way to help them, right? Because to your point, the transfer has been made, right? And it's a jurisdiction that's not going to be favorable, even if the FBI or, another enforcement agency got involved. And so that's how we're seeing this whole, what I would say is the evolution, quite frankly, of where cryptocurrency is going to kind of sit and how do we not stop innovation, right? The importance and criticalness of innovation and people that want to be around innovation and create innovation around cryptocurrency and blockchain technologies. We want them here in the United States, right? We don't want them going to other places where where they don't have to fear enforcement, du jour, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot going on around these things. It all comes back to seizure, forfeiture, protecting consumers. But again, the definitions, whether it's SEC and DOJ or what Mike is doing now with legislation that's now actually enacted in the EU, as we all know, it all intertwines. And so it's pretty fascinating time to be watching and to be involved in this space.
Yeah. Do you have an opinion on Trump's speech that he did at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville? I think one of his key talking points was this idea of a national strategic Bitcoin stockpile. I think his proposal or his idea was all of the Bitcoin that the U.S. government has seized would be moved to become a part of this strategic stockpile. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and there's also been talk about how to use it to take down some of the national deficit, right? And we've seen examples of this, I guess, in El Salvador, right? And we've seen other countries actually start, selling off their reserves. Number one, I'm surprised the issues become so partisan, right? And although now living in DC for 13 years, I guess I shouldn't be surprised it's become so partisan. But number two, I do want I want to see legislation here, and I want to see capability here and be smart about how we use, for example, energy and mining right here, right? And so I think his idea is a decent one on its face, but we haven't seen the details yet. But I think more importantly, not to get political, but pro cryptocurrency is pro innovation, right? And I think my understanding is, from what I've been reading, is that there are attempts to try to get Kamala Harris on board more so with the idea of accepting and understanding cryptocurrency and getting away from some of what Senator Warren's basically battle cry has been, because they're realizing it's becoming a voting issue. It's hard to believe, but I think it actually is, and because we now have 50 million Americans own at least one Bitcoin, or not one Bitcoin, but are invested in Bitcoin, right? That's a shocking number. And, you think about this, the Bitcoin spot ETF has now surpassed silver under assets under management. I mean, it's here to stay. And certainly Americans and the global citizens are very much invested in that. So I think the Republicans were smart to jump on that and say, hey, okay, we're going to figure this out. Now, we haven't seen the details yet, but I applaud any political, group that's saying, this is an innovation that we don't want to bleed out of the United States. We want it here. And so, but we'll see what the details look like. And it depends, obviously, on who gets elected. But I'm very happy that someone's very pro. That's really true.
Mm-hmm. I agree there. Generally speaking, how does the FBI think about Bitcoin? Are they wow, this is a cool new technology, but it's very frustrating, like that we can track it to some extent, but we can't seize it very well. And like to some extent, we also can't really track parts of it. Or is it
Yeah.
like they see it as like a very cool, innovative technology and they're like, oh, this thing like also has some problems like for us in the position that they're in.
Yeah. And again, I'm no longer with the FBI.
Yeah.
This is my opinion. But what I would say is during my time there, dealing with different technologies that were difficult. It was rare that we're like in awe of a technology, like, oh, this is such a cool technology. It's letting bad guys get away with all this stuff that we just can't seem to figure out. So, but I think the reality is right now is the Bureau understands how big, cryptocurrency is. And remember, it's not just about frauds. It's about illicit finance, terrorism financing. It's about, child smuggling, human smuggling. All of these terrible things play into it. But the reality is the numbers, the percentages of illicit activity have actually dropped because there's so much legitimate use, right? And so as an enforcement agency like the FBI, as an investigative agency, I should say, enforcement, they have to understand that there's also lots of legitimate uses, and they're seeing that, I'm sure, play out and working with companies that may have a problem with it. But really, they probably just see it as they don't have the luxury of to take a breath and say, "Oh, this is really cool." It's more like, okay, how can we get better? How do we get smarter? What else can we do from a data perspective, from a technology perspective, to be better at this? And the reality is, all violations more and more are now being impacted by cryptocurrency, whereas before we just kind of thought about it as really as a ransomware outlet, right? Mm-hmm. But now we know it's changed a lot, and even more so, with the October 7th issue and with Hamas and the Israeli conflict with the Palestinians, right? That kind of brought to the forefront. There's a lot of talk about terrorist financing at Hamas and the use of Bitcoin and things like that. But again, the numbers are quite, as I've seen and read about in my own work around this stuff, the numbers are not as prolific as people want to think they are with cryptocurrencies. But it's an easy scapegoat, right? To say, oh, look what it's doing. It's protecting and hiding people raising money to commit terrorism. And it certainly is at some point. But the reality is the use cases, as we all know, and certainly your audience understand, continues to grow. I mean, think about this. I mean, Brian Armstrong just was talking about this in an article 2 days ago, maybe today, where AI actually made a transaction token to token, right? I mean, so if I put my FBI hat on back again, if I know there are transactions occurring between two bots and exchanging tokens, they don't have access to a bank or a bank wallet, but they have access to a crypto wallet, right? That they have to get smart in this stuff. And I know they've got great people looking at this, but like this is not going away. It's only going to get bigger. When you think about bots trading tokens, like think about the exponential nature of this, right? And so I do think the Bureau is just probably like, oh, this is really hard, right? Yeah. Not so much like, oh, this is beautiful, this decentralized global technology that's cheaper and faster, right? Maybe when they retire, they appreciate it and they get into it. But right now, it's just because it's hard, and then the cases that you get involved in are so important and high priority. You're just trying to figure a way to
Gotcha. So they don't necessarily or a lot of people don't necessarily hate it. It's just like they're trying to do their job, and then they realize like this is kind of making their job harder or more difficult in the short term.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, as being a trained FBI agent, is you don't really have opinions so much on things as much as, okay, what's the hypothesis? What are we trying to figure out? How do we prove something, whether it's lawful or unlawful? Even an investigation that leads to actually people are innocent. That's still good use of resources because we actually saw that these people are not doing something that's illegal. And so you don't kind of get caught up in the weeds of like, oh my God, if we just get rid of cryptocurrency, everything in the world would be fine. They don't really see that. They just see like, oh, this is the challenge. These are the obstacles. How do we take those on? How do we partner with industry to take those on? How do we partner with our overseas partners or our intelligence partners to take that on? Because that's what it takes when something is this rapidly moving and innovate within a technology and innovation. You have to kind of depend on your partners outside your agency to get together on these things. Because as you can imagine, the intelligence community can move faster. And so we're always trying to have them share, if they can, on ways of successes that they're finding that we can use criminally in a court. And so that's usually what it looks like. But I don't think, I would think that most people that are investigating, that are really doing tracing in the weeds on crypto, probably understand it and probably can appreciate the technology.
Yeah. How about the concept or the ability to self-custody Bitcoin, and hold the private keys to the Bitcoin yourself? Is that a red flag, when the FBI is investigating it, or is it they just recognize that that's part of how this technology works? There are some benefits to being able to self-custody Bitcoin, and maybe it just makes their job harder, like we kind of just talked about, but they recognize it's not necessarily a red flag, or is it a red flag?
Well, it's hard to say in the sense that when we get brought in,
nobody likes paying taxes. And Bitcoin savers could be leaving a lot of money on the table if they don't have a sound financial plan and tax strategy. Sound Advisory is a leading financial advisory firm with over $150 million of assets under advisement. They'll work with you to optimize and file your taxes with Bitcoin-friendly CPAs while also developing personalized financial strategies that align with your specific goals. Check out Sound Advisory at thesoundadvisory.com for more information. That's thesoundadvisory.com. Now back to the show.
There's something already going on, right? So our antennas are up. We're looking at something, oftentimes the bad actors are predicated and we know they're already up to something, that gives us a sense. So we have to look at things suspiciously, right?
Yep.
But at the end of the day, we're also evidence-based, right? We have to be evidence-based. That's right. The old saying, just the facts, right? In the purest sense, what investigators do is they just want to collect the facts, right? The prosecutors and others have to figure out if those facts amount to a violation of a federal crime. In this case, I think, when you think about it, with these types of issues, number one, we have to be really okay with understanding that the analogy I'll use is tax evasion versus tax aversion. And so tax aversion is smart business. Tax evasion is a federal tax offense, right? And so for the people in your audience who are like, well, what's the difference, right? Well, if Joe, if you buy a home in the British Virgin Islands and you have a mortgage on that home, you will likely want to pay your mortgage from a BVI bank. Oh my God, you have a BVI bank account. You must be up to crime. You must be committing crime. And no, I'm just trying to pay the mortgage of the house that that my family always wanted. Or right. So there's lots of examples of legitimate uses of overseas accounts. There's lots of examples of, wallets being used that the Bureau will never be able to get access to, right? Because they're private and they're not through an exchange, or the exchange will pay all of those things. And so I think that's how we kind of think about it. And then the hard part is oftentimes the really savvy bad actors, they're commingling legitimate business and illegitimate business, right? And the commingling of funds and stuff like that. That gets tricky from a tracing standpoint. Think about it. They have a legitimate business over here. They're using those wallets to transact, completely legitimately. And then sometimes, every now and then, that wallet does something illegitimate. Okay. Well, think about a hot wallet at an exchange. Once it goes in there, it's kind of hard to think about, okay, well, let's trace it through. Well, hold on. Where else is it going? Well, that's going to be pretty hard to find out sometimes. Not that you can't find out sometimes, but if you think about it, those are traditional examples of how the analogies are for a wallet and what the challenges look like. But it's at the end of the day, I know people oh no, the FBI is just out to bury people, and all the men and women I work with, took that job. It's very hard. It's you don't get paid a lot. The hours are terrible because they want to help people and they want to do the right thing and they want to protect the Constitution, which is the oath we take. but I know that everybody feels, differently these days, but really, they just really want to try to help people. But they don't think about, okay, if I take this on, I'm going to change an industry or I'm going to change. Often we're too much in the weeds. We're just thinking about the case, not the bigger picture, not to get to retire and make a big move. You get to really kind of think about what's it all about. Sometimes it's just kind of the reality when you do investigations.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. What do you think about the future of fraud? I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, and you thought it's going to get kind of bigger and more prevalent. And maybe how does this tie into what you're doing at Fraud Optics?
Yeah. So I think the problem that we're seeing now is in some of the reports that some of the big tracing companies have put out, which are really detailed and informative. The last, like the 2023 report, as I've kind of alluded to, showed that the illicit use was actually down a little bit. I think people were surprised by that because, frankly, the legitimate use was so much bigger. The percentage-wise was going down. With the spot Bitcoin ETF, when that occurred, the fraudsters, the pig butchers didn't want to miss out either on the opportunity, as did the people that become victims of these things, right? Most of us think, I want to take advantage. I'm either going to buy Bitcoin directly. I have a Coinbase account. I've researched it. I know what I'm doing. Or I'm going to buy an ETF. I don't want to miss out. Or I'm going to buy and do MicroStrategies. That's my other way. I don't want to miss out, right? However, there's a lot of other people that have been hearing about Bitcoin going up and up and up. And then they're on a dating app and they haven't really thought about it. And then someone they're talking to says, hey, I've been making a lot of money on, Bitcoin. Oh, yeah, what's that all about? Right. And so, I think I can tell you from just the level of calls I'm getting into our firm about people being defrauded has begun to spike because it takes a couple months for the pig butchering and investment fraud scams around cryptocurrencies to take place. And then people realize they're being defrauded. And now you're starting to see it. And so the fraudsters are taking advantage of all the energy. And so people are jumping out. I don't want to miss out. And so I think the FOMO-ness of that has gone up. And it goes up again where now we have ETH, right? So with more adoption, which is obviously a very good thing for the technology and necessary for mass adoption, is the way it's growing is a good thing. But with it, we're seeing more fraud. And I think the more legitimate uses we see for cryptocurrency, the more opportunity we're going to see bad actors want to use it, right? And get people confused or not sure. Oh, wait a minute, it's going through. Wait, what's a mixer now? Is that going to be a problem, right? And so, these are some of the issues that I am concerned about, even though the legitimate use is expanding. And so, going to answer your question, and I appreciate the question. When I first was getting into cryptocurrency investigations, I was getting so many calls from people like I couldn't help, right? They'd already transferred their crypto to a wallet per instructions from the bad actors, and it was gone. Initially, I was like, well, why is there not a central repository for known bad wallets or for data around bad wallets? Sanctioned wallets, I can look those up, through OFAC. But, the Australian Federal Police, as an example, maybe they sanctioned a wallet, but it's not on this list, right? And there's wonderful groups like Open Sanctions that do a lot of good work around that. And then you might have like a state like California say, hey, we're seeing something really interesting around, some fraud around these wallets. And those wallets are published, but no one centralizes that information, right? And so it was very frustrating just to see if I could look at a wallet and say, let me see if there's an issue with this wallet. And so that really brought me back to my time at Exeger, thinking about some of the bigger data problems. And it was wonderful because we would do tracing in cases with all the big firms that are really capable, have amazing people, doing great work around tracing on the blockchain. Blockchain is really hard, especially with the jumping of chains. And as we all know, there's so much the investment around that. That's a hard problem with so many chains coming out, and when bad actors know enough to jump around, that's a tough problem that has to be worked on and every day with a lot of smart people. And I think what was happening is that people had forgotten about some of this really nice data that's open source that may be relevant to blockchain activity, specifically a wallet, maybe good or bad, that was being discarded or not thought of holistically in the sense of either doing an investigation on their wallet or compliance to prevent something bad from happening with a transaction before it occurs. And so when I started to have some more success with cryptocurrency investigations, I kept going back to where I was finding success. And yes, we were still tracing it using a blockchain, and that was great. But it's when we could find avenues to find what I call off-chain data that helped us kind of tell that picture and help us really inform us more about an entity or a person or some sort of relationship, so I could understand potentially who had committed that issue or who was behind that illicit movement or that transfer. The example that's really kind of an easy one is that just like in fraudsters in general, fraudsters are not always fraudsters. Maybe they had a legitimate business and then they became a fraudster. And some people, they'll use a wallet when they're trying to, broker NFTs, right? And if they're selling NFTs, they want people to know who they are. They want to know that people can, that they are a legitimate person. And so they put some things around that, like an ETH address or a YouTube video and their picture. And like, I'm a legitimate broker. You should buy NFTs from me. You can trust me. And this is who I am. This is why I'm really involved and passionate about NFTs. And then that person may also have a life of fraud later on, and they get lazy and they're using the same wallet. But if they're using that wallet in a marketplace for NFTs, as we know, there may be some other nice things attached to that. And so some of the successes we were finding is that example where, okay, we have a wallet. Where else can we search for that wallet that's not blockchain, right? And you think about marketplaces is a really good place, right? As an example, because there's often biographical data associated with it, right? And so at Fraud Optics, we were like, wait a minute. What if we started thinking about scraping relevant open source data specific to understanding more about a wallet, good or bad, right? Because the flip side is you can have a wallet that may seem suspicious, but if you look at it on an off-chain example, oh no, it's the person is legitimate. They're doing all of these things. It makes sense. I get it now. Because oftentimes when we look at a wallet on blockchain, someone got defrauded, and we look at it like, yeah, there's nothing on it that looks suspicious. It's acting kind of rather normal, or there's really no behavior that I would say would be raise alarms, right? There's no labels on it that are concerning. But then when you layer the off-chain data that we found on top of that wallet, you would say, oh my God, you would never want to transact there. It was mentioned in a GitHub, leak, and that leak was out on GitHub, and then they took it down, right? But we grabbed it. And so you can't find it, but we have it, right? And so we think about where data transfers over from the blockchain to off-chain and find connections. So what we do, we scrape from all these places, and we pull it in a database, and then we look for those relationships and help inform our clients to say, from a compliance standpoint, if you want to do holistically screening with blockchain and with off-chain gives you a much better understanding of, okay, if I want to keep wallets that have some risk off my ecosystem as a company, as a bank, as an exchange, we're going to give you data that gives you better ability to make that decision. Or hopefully more and more companies are doing risk assessments about cryptocurrency, right? A lot of good corporate corporations around the world, multinationals, don't want to miss out, as we know, on the younger demographic that is quite comfortable with currency. So they're trying to figure out how to transact in that, right? There's a long list of companies we all know that do take cryptocurrency now. That list is going to grow, but they also have really valuable clients that they don't want defrauded. So how do they know that those wallets are safe? And if you're able to bring in as much data as you can, and this is what I learned from this work that I was doing at Exeget, the more information I can look at to make a decision that's informed, I can then figure out what my tolerance is for risk. So if a company is like, okay, we want to transact in cryptocurrency because of the demographic, it makes sense, whether it's unbanked, it's speed, whatever the reason is, but they want to protect their clients, right? They need to think about, how do I do that in a way? And so risk assessment is something that we've been doing it for years, but just not with cryptocurrency. So now we're starting to see that more and more, so they can understand what their appetite is, and then they can figure out, okay, what level of risk are we willing to put up with in cryptocurrency transactions, right? And so we help our clients with that from a compliance standpoint, specifically like, hey, let's screen before you transfer, right? Ask a few questions before you say, oh, well, I met this really nice person on this dating website. They told me to open this account. You just send something over here. Okay, sounds good. Let's ask a few questions. Let's see if we know anything about that wallet before we send it, right? Because as I said, we've been talking about this the whole conversation. Once it's sent, it's much more difficult, if not impossible, to help them with that. So those are things that we help our clients with. And then on the flip side, as you can imagine, investigations, at the end of the day, they have to end with people. It's entities and people, but ultimately somebody, we want to tie that transaction, that transfer. Yes, we've got some wallets, maybe some exchanges, we can see some activity, but ultimately we want to tie that to a person that we can actually either charge or go after or be held responsible civilly or criminally, right? And so lead generation around wallets is also something that we can really help the tracing side of things, right? They're very focused on the blockchain as we described, but bringing in that off-chain data, and we can do it at scale. We bring automation to that, so they can check millions of wallets, not just check a few wallets in a Google search or against sanctions to see if there's a red flag over here. Why not check millions of data points to see if there's anything out there and say, hey, by the way, interesting, that wallet was mentioned in a white paper talking about terrorism financing in West Africa. Oh, it was? Well, who wrote that paper? That's a lead, right? That's a warm lead to follow up with. And so that's the kind of world we're thinking about. And that's the gap of intelligence around open source data that we're attacking and finding a lot of success with.
Very interesting. One of the things that you brought up there was NFTs. Do you know if NFTs are like commonly used for money laundering? I've always been like somewhat suspicious and seeing like, oh, this picture of a monkey just sold for $1 million. And I'm like, who actually bought that for $1 million? And it's like, would it be possible that person that's doing the money laundering creates this image, buys it from themselves, and then on the other end, they're like, oh, I got this $1 million perfectly fair and square. I sold an NFT and I bought it from some other person I don't even know. But in reality, like they just sold it to themselves and the money looks clean. Is that something that happens commonly, or have you ever heard about that or no?
We know absolutely that's occurring, right? And so anytime you have an asset that could be transferable, that would be seen as liquid, even none, you have to think about money laundering. And there have been numerous examples of this occurring. It's certainly an issue that has to be looked at. Trade-based money laundering is very similar in that sense. So it is without a doubt an issue. And so as we see the NFT market starting to grow again a little bit, right? We're starting to see it come back a little bit. We're seeing, legitimate big box stores like Target, offer an NFT with a product that I'm going to buy off the shelf, right? Sports paraphernalia is a great example, right? Those things I think will likely grow, concerts and things like that with tickets, right? But with that, as we've been discussing, there comes risk and again, the need to understand, who's behind that transaction. And so the problem we're going to keep running into is that people are attracted to, and from a privacy standpoint, to cryptocurrency because they can be rather anonymous in their transactions. And I understand where they're coming from. Like people don't want to, have to be, people want to be private about their transactions. It's a natural thing and it's in some ways a smart thing, but there has to be some give and take on this issue. And the NFT business as it starts to grow, the NFT marketplaces, they don't want to be associated with money laundering or any sort of illicit activity for that matter. And so they're on top of these things too. Obviously the legitimate ones, they want to take these things on too. Because again, once people feel more comfortable, adoption goes up or NFTs are sold, right? And so that is certainly occurring. There's been several examples of it, without a doubt, and likely, unfortunately, will probably grow as a problem. Again, it's not going to be a huge issue, but it's something that's it certainly will have the attention of regulatory oversight if and when there's legislation that's passed here in the United States, as an example. Right? They're going to say, wait, how else do we protect consumers? Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. A few more questions and we can start to close it out. And feel free to give shorter answers to these if you like. Are there common chains that people are using for like money laundering or fraud? Like Is Bitcoin commonly used? Is Ethereum commonly used? Are other cryptos commonly used? Are stable coins commonly used? Or is there not anyone in particular?
I mean, the easy one is Monero, right? That's not a big update for your audience. I think there's been some, uptick in other lesser known, tokens around terrorist financing. What I would say is that I think the thinking is to get away from some of the more well-known types of tokens, because I think a lot of the bad actors think there's more understanding, there's more tools, there's more technology that can be leveraged, and there's more people are more aware potentially of like what should and shouldn't be occurring, with these tokens versus a meme coin that's being used or something like that. So in money laundering in general, you always see structuring and people moving. So in the traditionally in money laundering, we'd see people moving from account to account to account. 100 million goes in, 100 million goes out the next day, right? Same thing with wallets that we see, right? When the illicit actors are moving it around, and maybe a very, very, very small percentage goes to this person who got paid that move. You can see that happening all the time. So what you do see is more than anything is just they want to keep moving it around. And ideally, the more chains, the better, right? Because they think, oh, wait, that group does have the technology to trace it on that chain. Okay, then we want to go there, right? And so today it could be this, and tomorrow it will be that, but they're just going to want to keep it moving. But the place that we always want to look for is when they're converting it, right? Eventually, they go to a traditional financial place, ideally, likely to so they can transfer the money out. That's the one opportunity governments and others have a chance to actually, in theory, seize and freeze. But it's the movement. Yeah, I wouldn't want to say it's one of the other.
Gotcha. That makes sense. What's something that you believe that you think most people in the Bitcoin community would like disagree with?
I think the biggest thing is, and I know it's been probably an annoying theme, but the reality is if we're going to have adoption of this technology, right? And I know the market always is ahead of government, right? And that's always how it should be. And the government's always trying to catch up. That we have to give up a little, right, on the decentralized anonymous nature of this for it to really reach the adoption levels that are necessary and to protect consumers. And so, and what does that look like? I don't know what that looks like yet. I think we're just trying to all struggle through what that looks like. And so I think there's going to have to be some give on both sides, right? The government's going to want to say, okay, we understand it. We don't want to curb technology. We never want to. But we also want to try to protect people. And so, I think some people have to get comfortable a little bit with, having some amount of, data attached to a wallet for this to really succeed. There's ways to protect that. There's ways to layer that. And there's ways to control that in a way that I think most people would feel comfortable. But I don't see a scenario playing out where the governments like the United States, as examples, could be like, hey, no problem, just guys do your thing. No worries. We're not going to be worried about all these issues where people are getting defrauded because we can't find it. Quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Last question, then we can close it out. What do you think is the biggest risk to Bitcoin? It might kind of be related to what you just said, or maybe something completely different.
Yeah, I think the biggest risk is the Achilles heel, I believe, of a private wallet that people just can't access. And I think the other part you always see is I'm not ageist, but a lot of my older friends are like, well, hold on, why would anybody invest in that? It seems like just it's like a big fraud, or I don't want to get involved. That's not legitimate. That problem, education, I think, is so important, and we just need to get better at people like myself, serious people like yourself, Joe, who can sit with people, take the time to say, I'm going to explain, speed, less cost, global capabilities, all the beautifulness that comes with it, and take the time to educate people, young and old, right, about how the technology works and how to protect themselves, right? And so really, I guess, thinking about it more, education is the most important and is the thing holding a lot of people back. But this has been a heck of a year for cryptocurrency, and I think it's just starting. So, hold on tight.
Absolutely. Well, Ren, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down with us for this episode. where can people go learn more about you and what you're building?
Yeah, so fraudoptics.com is our company. Again, we're really excited about what we're doing there. You can find me on LinkedIn. I go by George Ren McEachern. I'm sure that the name will be on the podcast. But I also, if people want to reach out or they have questions or they want to challenge me on something I said, or I'm not always right, of course. So find me on LinkedIn or come go to the company or even Ren at fraudoptics.com. I'm not hiding. Come talk to me. But Joe, thank you so much for the time as well. And really appreciate what you're doing and getting the word out on so many levels about what's occurring in the industry. It's so important that people like yourself doing this who are completely dedicated to it. So really appreciate what you guys are doing. But thanks for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your time.